Welcome to the dark past. Step into the shadows of history, where secrets, scandals, and forbidden stories come alive. In the comments below, tell us, which city are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. They were born into the same morning, the same heat, the same cry of cicadas cutting through the air like a blade. The plantation midwife later said it felt wrong from the start. Two babies arriving back to back, their cries overlapping, as if neither was willing to enter the world alone. The woman whispered a prayer under her breath, not for mercy, but for endurance. In that place, mercy was a rumor, endurance was survival. The boy came first, broad-shouldered even as an infant, with a quiet gaze that seemed to take in more than it should. The girl followed moments later, smaller, fierce, her cry sharper, refusing silence. They were named by the master, not with care but convenience, names meant to be called loudly across fields, names that fit neatly into ledgers. What the master did not name, could not name, was the bond that settled between them the moment they were laid side by side. They learned the world together, learned hunger together, learned pain together. When one cried, the other stilled. When one was struck, the other remembered. The plantation was a place of rigid order, but siblings were an inconvenience to that order. They were meant to be separated by task, by age, by usefulness. Yet somehow they remained near each other, orbiting like two bodies bound by gravity no overseer could see. Their mother died when they were young, worked until her body simply stopped responding. There was no ceremony, no marker, just a space in the ground that filled itself again with weeds. After that, the siblings clung tighter. At night, they slept back to back on the dirt floor of the quarters, whispering stories they made up themselves, stories of rivers that carried you away instead of drowning you, stories of forests that swallowed people whole and kept them safe, stories where no one was owned. The boy learned early to be quiet, to watch, to remember routes, schedules, patterns. He carried water, hauled timber, worked close enough to hear overseers talk when they thought no one was listening. The girl learned to speak when silence would get her killed. She worked in the washhouse, places where gossip flowed freely and truth slipped out between complaints. She remembered names, faces, grudges. She remembered who drank too much and who never slept, who feared snakes, who feared the dark. Together, without ever calling it a plan, they began to collect the plantation like a map inside their minds. They watched people try to run. Most did not make it far. Some were caught before they reached the trees. Others were tracked for days, brought back broken, their punishment delivered as a lesson to everyone else. The siblings never looked away. They watched the way dogs followed scent. They watched how riders cut off routes, how bounty men thought. They listened to the language of the hunt. One night, after a man was dragged back with his feet barely touching the ground, the girl whispered, "If we ever go, we don't go like that." The boy didn't answer right away. He stared at the dark ceiling, listening to the breathing around them. Finally he said, "If we go together." That was the vow, not spoken loudly, not repeated often, but it settled into them like bone. Years passed, their bodies changed. The plantation did not, whips still cracked, fields still burned under the sun. Children were still born into chains as casually as livestock, but the siblings were no longer children. The boy had grown tall and strong, trusted with heavier work. The girl had learned how to disappear into plain sight, how to hear things meant to stay hidden. The first real opportunity came by accident. A trader arrived one afternoon, arguing loudly with the master about prices, about losses, about people who had vanished and cost money. He complained about routes, about patrols, about how the land itself seemed to fight him. The siblings worked nearby, heads down, hands moving, ears open. That night, the girl repeated word to her brother perfectly. He corrected her once gently. He said the river bends west before it splits, he said. She nodded. That's right. They began to talk in fragments after that, half sentences, shared looks. They spoke of ordinary things, weather, work, aches, but layered beneath was something else, distances, directions, timing. They did not rush. They watched seasons change. They waited for the right combination of distraction and darkness. They waited until the plantation grew complacent, until routines hardened and curiosity dulled. They waited until the master stopped counting faces every night. The night they chose did not feel special at first. The air was thick, heavy with impending rain. Thunder rolled far off, a low promise. Guards complained about the weather, about wet powder, about being uncomfortable. Dogs were restless, uneasy. The girl slipped away first, exactly as planned. Not running. Walking. Moving with the confidence of someone who belonged. She carried nothing that would mark her as fleeing. No bundle, no shoes. Just her body and what she carried inside her head. The boy followed later, after the last count, after the final lamp dimmed. He moved slower, heavier, knowing his size made him visible. He took the route they had walked 100 times in daylight, then veered off where no one ever looked. They did not meet at the edge of the plantation. They met beyond it, in a place where the ground turned soft and the trees grew closer together, swallowing sound. When they saw each other, they did not speak, they did not embrace. They stood side by side, breathing hard, listening. Behind them, the plantation slept, unaware it had already lost them. They moved through the night with purpose, not panic. They crossed shallow streams to break scent. They doubled back once, deliberately to confuse tracks. They entered the swamp just as the rain began, heavy drops erasing footprints, washing the world clean. By morning, the alarm would sound. By midday, men would ride. By nightfall, bounties would be whispered, then shouted. But for those first hours, as rain soaked their skin and mud swallowed their steps, the siblings felt something neither had ever felt before. Not freedom, choice. They did not know yet that nearly 100 men would one day hunt them, that their names would spread across counties, that rewards would multiply and egos would be bruised. They did not know they were beginning a story people would tell wrong for generations. All they knew was that they were no longer where they were supposed to be, and that neither had left the other behind. By the second night, the land had already begun to change its face for them. What had once been a familiar world, fields cut into neat lines, paths worn smooth by years of forced labor, was gone. In its place stretched something older and less forgiving. The forest did not care about ownership. The swamp did not remember names. The siblings felt it immediately, the way sound behaved differently, the way darkness pressed closer, thicker, as if the night itself were listening. They did not speak as they moved. Words were heavy, unnecessary. Every sound mattered now, the snap of a twig, the pull of breath through tired lungs, the faint slosh of mud releasing a foot. They had learned long ago how easily noise traveled when men were hunting. The girl led, not because she was faster or stronger, but because she carried the map. It was not drawn on paper. It lived in her memory, stitched together from overheard arguments, careless boasts, and the bitter complaints of men who believed no one worth listening to was listening. River bends, forgotten trails, low ground that flooded without warning. Places riders avoided, places dogs struggled in, places men feared because they did not understand them. She moved with certainty that surprised even her brother. At the edge of the swamp she paused. He stopped instantly, sensing the char. NGE in her posture. "This is where they'll expect us to turn back," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. "So we won't." The swamp opened before them like a mouth. Water swallowed their ankles, then their calves. The ground shifted with every step, unstable, sucking, cold. Insects rose in clouds, biting exposed skin, winding near ears. The smell of rot and life mixed together, overwhelming and thick. They welcomed it. Mud erased footprints better than rain ever could. Water carried scent away, confusing dogs, breaking trails. Men hated swamps because swamps did not obey rules. Horses stumbled, rifles rusted. Fear grew louder than commands. They waded deeper, moving slowly, deliberately, placing feet where the girl remembered shallow ground should be. When it wasn't, they adjusted without panic, gripping roots using fallen logs as bridges. Once the boy sank nearly to his waist before catching himself, arms trembling as he pulled free. She did not rush to help him. She waited until he stabilized, then nodded once and moved on. Panic wasted strength. Strength would be needed. They traveled until dawn and then did not stop. Daylight was more dangerous than night. Shadows thinned, birds scattered at movement, sound carried farther. They pushed deeper into cover, into a stand of cypress where roots rose like knuckles from the water, creating a maze no horse could navigate. There, they rested, not sleeping, just stilling their bodies enough to breathe. The girl pressed leaves and mud against her skin, dulling her scent. The boy submerged himself up to his neck in the dark water, ignoring the leeches, forcing his breathing slow and shallow. By mid-morning they heard it. The horn, long and sharp, carried on the wind, the sound of the plantation waking up to their absence. Soon would come shouting, confusion, anger. Soon after that, pursuit. The boy closed his eyes briefly, not in fear but in focus. "They'll start where we slept," he murmured. She nodded. "And they'll go north." He glanced at her. "So we go south." "No," she said. "We go nowhere." He frowned. She pointed to the water around them. "We let them run." They stayed in that stand of cypress for hours, bodies aching, muscles screaming to move. Mosquitoes bit relentlessly. The sun climbed high, turning the swamp into a steaming bowl. Sweat mixed with swamp water, stinging eyes, slicking skin. They did not move. By afternoon they heard voices, distant at first, then closer, men shouting instructions, dogs barking, confused and angry, the sound of boots splashing, curses rising as water swallowed steps. The boy's hands curled slowly into fists, then relaxed again. He knew his strength. He also knew strength was useless against numbers. The girl counted voices. 5. Then more. Then a cluster of dogs brought closer, handlers struggling to control them. One dog broke free and charged ahead, nose down, tail stiff. It ran directly toward the cypress stand. The girl's heart pounded, but her face remained still. She slid her hand into the water, disturbing the surface just enough to create ripples moving away from them. She tossed a handful of mud toward a fallen branch farther off, letting it splash loudly. The dog veered. It followed the false disturbance, barking triumphantly. The handlers shouted, encouraged, splashing after it. The sound moved away. The boy let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. They stayed until nightfall. When darkness returned, they moved again, not deeper into the swamp but sideways, skirting its edge, using it like a wall. They followed game trails invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. The girl tested the ground ahead with a stick, avoiding sinkholes that could swallow a person whole. Near midnight, rain returned, sudden and heavy. Thunder cracked overhead, lightning splitting the sky. The siblings welcomed it like a blessing. They ran, not blindly but with urgency now let in. The rain cover sound, letting wind erase scent. They crossed open ground where they would never have dared in daylight, trusting the storm to hide them. By dawn, they were miles away, but so were the hunters. The next day, the sound of pursuit multiplied. It was no longer just plantation riders. Word had spread. Men with no connection to the place, drawn by reward and reputation, joined the hunt. Bounty hunters, trackers, men who made their living chasing others. They were better organized, louder, more confident. The siblings adjusted. They stopped traveling in straight lines. They doubled back across streams, walked for long stretches in water to confuse dogs. They climbed rocky ground that cut feet and slowed horses. Once, they climbed a ridge, only to descend the same way, erasing tracks with careful steps. The boy learned quickly how to use his size against the hunters, not by hiding it, but by misdirecting it. He left false signs deliberately, broken branches at shoulder height, footprints leading nowhere. He wanted them to think he was careless, strong but stupid. The girl erased their true trail behind him. That night, as they rested in a shallow cave barely large enough to crouch in, the girl finally spoke what had been forming in her mind. "They'll keep adding men," she said. "Not because they need them, because they can't stand failing." The boy nodded. "Then we make them chase longer." She looked at him. Together, they did not know yet that the number would grow to nearly 100, that whole counties would be dragged into obsession, that their escape would stop being about capture and start being about pride. For now, it was still about survival. And survival, they were learning, belonged to those who understood the land better than the men who claimed to own it. By the third stretch of days, running stopped being an action and became a way of thinking. The land no longer appeared as a single place but as a series of choices, left or right, high ground or low, water or brush, noise or silence. Not just for the next hour but for days ahead. Hunger sharpened those choices. Exhaustion made them dangerous. They had not eaten properly since before they fled. The boy's stomach cramped constantly now, a dull ache that flared whenever he pushed too hard. The girl felt it too, though she never spoke of it. She rationed movement, conserving energy, choosing moments carefully. Survival was no longer about speed, it was about patience. On the third morning they reached pine country. The swamp fell away behind them, replaced by rolling ground, dry needles cushioning each step. The air smelled cleaner here, less rot, more resin, but safety thinned with the trees. Pines stood tall and straight, offering fewer hiding places. Sound traveled farther. Sightlines stretched longer. Hunters loved pine land. The girl slowed them immediately, signaling with a raised hand. They crouched, listening. Far off, voices, multiple, not shouting now, talking, calm, confident. Men who believed they were close. The boy's jaw tightened. They're learning. Yes, she said, which means we change again. They turned east, angling toward a shallow ravine she remembered from overheard conversations. A place where rainwater carved deep cuts into the earth, collapsing ground unpredictably. Horses avoided it, men disliked it, but it was dry enough now to move through. They descended into it just as the sun rose fully, light filtering down in broken lines. The ravine swallowed them, dirt walls rising shoulder-high in places, higher in others. Their footsteps became whispers. They moved like shadows within a shadow. Halfway through, the boy froze. A sound, not voices, not dogs, metal. The faint clink of gear. Hunters above. They pressed into the dirt wall, bodies flat, breath controlled. The girl counted heartbeats, willing them to slow. She could hear her own pulse. In her ears, louder than any footstep. Boots appeared at the rim, silhouetted against the sky. A man leaned over, scanning the ravine below. His rifle hung loose in his hands, casual, confident. He spat into the ravine. The spit landed inches from the girl's hand. She did not move. After a moment, the man stepped back, calling something to others. Laughter followed. They moved on, convinced the ravine was empty. Only when the sound faded completely did the siblings allow themselves to breathe fully again. They waited another hour before moving. By afternoon, hunger forced risk. They found wild onions near a stream, dug them out carefully, chewing slowly, savoring bitterness like a feast. The boy caught a small fish with his bare hands after several failed attempts, slipping in the mud, gritting his teeth against frustration. They ate silently, gratefully. That night, they made a mistake. It was small, understandable, deadly. They built a fire, just a flicker, hidden between rocks, shielded from wind. They needed warmth. They needed to dry their clothes. They needed the comfort of something human. Smoke rose anyway. Thin, faint, but visible. They extinguished it quickly, cursing themselves, scattering ash, covering signs. But damage was done. By dawn, dogs found the area. The chase that followed was nothing like before. This time it was fast. Shouts erupted behind them. Dogs bayed, sharp and eager. Hooves thundered through pine needles. Orders snapped through the air. Run, they ran. Branches whipped faces. Roots grabbed feet. Breath burned lungs. The boy took the lead now, strength finally unleashed, pushing through brush, breaking through barriers meant to slow men. The girl stayed close, refusing to fall behind. They burst into open ground, a meadow sloping downward toward a river. No cover, no shadows, the worst possible place. The boy hesitated only a second before veering straight into it. He knew stopping meant capture. He knew speed was their only chance. Shots rang out. Not aimed yet, warning shots. Meant to frighten, to make them stumble. Dirt kicked up near their feet. The girl felt a bullet tear through her sleeve without touching skin. They reached the river just as dogs closed in. The water was high, fast from recent rain. The boy grabbed his sister without slowing, leaping into the current. Cold slammed into them, stealing breath. The river dragged them sideways immediately, spinning, disorienting. The boy fought to keep them above water, muscles screaming. Dogs hit the water seconds later, splashing, snarling. The girl twisted free, shouting over the roar, "Let it take us!" They stopped fighting the current and let it pull them, bodies battered against debris, lungs burning. They stayed submerged as long as they could, surfacing only for brief gasps, then sinking again. The river carried them far downstream before spitting them out against a fallen tree. They clung there, half drowned, shaking uncontrollably. Dogs barked upstream, confused, losing the trail. Men shouted, angry, arguing about where to search next. Eventually, the sounds faded. They lay there until night returned, too exhausted to move, too alive to sleep. The boy finally laughed, soft, broken, disbelieving. "They almost had us." The girl stared at the stars through branches overhead. "No," she said quietly, "they thought they did." From that night on, the hunt changed. The story spread faster than the siblings moved. Men talked about the two who ran into rivers like ghosts, who vanished in open land, who used the earth itself as armor. Each failure added exaggeration. Each escape sharpened fear. More men joined. Not because it made sense, but because pride demanded it. And somewhere between exhaustion and survival, the siblings began to understand something powerful. They were no longer just running. They were being followed by their own legend, by the fourth stretch of their flight, exhaustion. Dee stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like a second skin. It clung to them no matter how they moved. When they rested, it pressed heavier. When they walked, it dragged behind them. Their bodies were no longer fully theirs. They were instruments being pushed forward by will alone. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and uneasy, haunted by sounds that might not have been real. Hunger had dulled into something quiet and constant, a hollow presence that no longer demanded attention because there was nothing left to give it. The land changed again. The hills steepened and broke apart into jagged rises, their sides cut by old erosion scars and narrow gullies. Trees thinned at the crests and thickened in the folds, creating pockets of darkness even during the day. Fog rolled in unpredictably, clinging to low ground in pale sheets that swallowed sound and distance. It was beautiful in a way that felt cruel. They moved carefully now, not because they were afraid of being seen, but because a single misstep could send one of them tumbling down rock and root into silence. The boy's injured leg had worsened overnight. The swelling had spread. The skin stretched tight and hot beneath his trousers. He tried to hide the limp, tightening his jaw every time weight shifted onto it, but the girl saw everything. She said nothing. Instead, she altered the rhythm of their movement, shorter bursts, longer pauses, routes that curved instead of climbed when possible. She chose shaded paths where the ground stayed cool and damp, easing the strain on his leg. She let him lead when she sensed his pride bristling, and stepped ahead when she felt his strength wavering. It was a quiet negotiation between them, one they had practiced since childhood. By mid-morning they heard the first horn. Not close, not yet, but unmistakable. It echoed across the hills, a long, deliberate call meant to carry, a signal not just to men but to morale. We are here. We are many. We are not stopping. The boy exhaled slowly through his nose. They're coordinating. Yes, she said. They weren't before. They're learning. So are we. They veered off their intended path and descended into a narrow ravine choked with undergrowth. Thorns tore at their clothes and skin, leaving thin lines of blood that stung and itched. The boy nearly slipped twice, catching himself on branches that bent dangerously under his weight. At the bottom of the ravine, water trickled over stones, barely more than a whisper. The girl knelt and pressed her hand into the mud, then smeared it across their boots and lower legs, masking scent. They followed the ravine for hours, letting it carry them sideways through the hills instead of forward. It was slow, painfully slow, but it broke patterns, and patterns were what hunters relied on. By afternoon the fog thickened. It crept in low at first, then rose, wrapping the world in pale grey. Visibility shrank to a few yards. Sound behaved strangely, echoing from the wrong directions, distorting distance. The girl stopped abruptly. "What?" the boy whispered. She held up a hand, listening. Footsteps, not close enough to see, but close enough to hear. Careful steps, controlled breathing, men who knew how to move quietly. "They've spread into pairs," she murmured, "smaller groups." "Smart," he said. "Yes, and dangerous." They pressed themselves into the ravine wall, bodies still, breaths shallow. The fog thickened, beading moisture on hair and skin. The footsteps passed above them, unseen, followed by the faint clink of metal. One voice murmured something indistinct. Another answered. Then silence. They waited long after the sounds faded. When they finally moved again, the girl led them up out of the ravine and onto a narrow ridge barely wider than a footpath. On one side, the land fell away steeply. On the other, brush and rock pressed close. It was risky. It was also the last place anyone expected them to be. They followed the ridge until dusk, then descended into a shallow cave formed by a collapsed rock face. It was cramped and cold, but dry. The girl layered leaves and dirt at the entrance, obscuring it just enough to break its shape. That night, the boy's leg finally betrayed him. As he shifted in his sleep, a sharp pain jolted him awake. He bit down on his sleeve to keep from crying out, body shaking. The girl was instantly alert, her hand already covering his mouth before sound could escape. He nodded frantically, sweat slick on his face. She examined the leg in the dim light, fingers gentle but firm. The swelling had worsened. The skin was angry and red. Infection, maybe, or just trauma. Either way, it would not heal without rest they did not have. She tore a strip from her dress and bound the leg tightly, stabilizing it as best she could. He watched her hands move, steady and precise, and felt something twist painfully in his chest. "I'm slowing us," he whispered. When she finished, she met his eyes. "You're still moving. For now." She leaned closer, her forehead touching his. "Listen to me. We do not measure worth by speed. We measure it by resolve." He swallowed hard. "And if I can't go on?" Her voice did not waver. "Then we change how we go on." Outside, the fog thickened further, muting the world completely. It felt like being suspended in nothing. At dawn, they woke to voices, close, too close. The girl tensed instantly, pressing herself against the cave wall. The boy reached for his knife, gripped tight despite trembling hands. Through the fog, shapes moved, shadows passing, at least 3 men. Maybe more. One of them stopped. The girl's heart slammed against her ribs. A dog whined. She slid her hands slowly into the dirt, fingers closing around a small stone. She waited, muscles coiled, mind calculating distance and timing. The dog pulled forward, nose low, sniffing. The girl threw the stone, not toward the dog but behind the men, letting it strike rock with a sharp crack. The men spun, shouting. The dog lunged in the opposite direction, barking wildly. "Over there!" one of them yelled. They moved away quickly, boots crunching, voices fading. The girl did not breathe until the sound was completely gone. They waited another hour before emerging. The fog lifted by midday, revealing the valley below them and the full scope of what they were facing. Camps dotted the landscape. Smoke rose in thin columns. Men moved in lines, coordinated now, purposeful. Riders patrolled open ground while others combed brush and ravines. Dogs crisscrossed the land like living nets. The number had grown again, not dozens, scores. The boy stared, numb. "They brought half the county." The girl's jaw tightened. "And they still won't stop. Why?" he asked quietly. "We're just 2 people." She shook her head. "We're not anymore." She was right. They could feel it in the way the land responded to their presence now, as if every step carried weight beyond their bodies. They could hear it in the urgency of the hunt, the way it had become less about reward and more about control. They were no longer being chased because they were valuable. They were being chased because they had refused to be erased. As night fell, they moved again, slipping between patrols, using shadows like tools. The boy leaned heavily on his sister now, and she bore it without complaint, teeth clenched, muscles burning. Somewhere behind them, a horn sounded again, angrier this time, but it was answered by nothing, because the siblings were already gone, folding themselves into the dark, carrying with them the quiet, terrifying truth that the hunt was no longer in the hunter's control, and the land knew it. By the time the 5th stretch began, the idea of distance had warped. Miles no longer meant anything, neither did hours. What mattered now were moments, the few heartbeats it took to cross open ground, the silent count. T before a breath could be drawn, the narrow margins between being unseen and being finished. The world had narrowed into those slivers, and everything else had fallen away. They moved before dawn, because dawn was when men believed themselves safest. Patrols relaxed slightly after long nights. Dogs grew restless. Attention thinned. The girl timed their departures carefully, trusting rhythm over instinct. The boy's leg was worse. He could still move, but every step sent a dull shock through his body, radiating upward, blurring thought. He clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. Pride kept him upright longer than strength did. Love kept him moving. They descended from the hills into a patchwork of abandoned farmland and wild regrowth. Old fences half swallowed by vines, collapsed sheds, fields returned to scrub. It was land caught between use and neglect, filled with hiding places and traps alike. Smoke drifted in the distance again, closer this time. The girl slowed, crouching low, scanning. "They're leapfrogging," she murmured, "setting camps ahead of where they think we'll be." The boy nodded. "They're trying to box us in." "Yes, can they?" She didn't answer immediately. She studied the land the way a gambler studies cards, reading tells others didn't know they had. "Only if we stay together the way they expect." He looked at her sharply. "No," she met his gaze. "Listen." He shook his head before she could continue. You said we don't disappear separately." "I said we don't stop caring separately," she corrected softly. "Those aren't the same thing." Silence stretched between them, heavy and fragile. "You're hurt," she continued, "and they know it. They're tightening because they think we'll slow, that we'll make mistakes." He clenched his fists. "We already are." "Yes," she said, "which means we have to give them something to chase." He understood then, and fear flashed across his face, not for himself, but for her. "They'll kill you." She shook her head. "They want capture, proof, a body only if they have to, and they don't know me the way they think they know you." He stepped closer despite the pain, lowering his voice. "I won't let you." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to be still. "You will," she said quietly, "because you trust me, and because you know this isn't surrender, it's misdirection." He swallowed hard, eyes shining. "How long?" "As long as it takes for them to believe," she said. "Then we circle back. And if you can't," she leaned in, resting her forehead against his, "then you keep going anyway." They did not argue further. There was no time left for that. They chose the place carefully. A narrow valley where tracks would be easy to follow, bordered by open ground that funneled movement. The girl moved first, deliberately leaving signs this time. Broken branches, clear footprints, a discarded scrap of cloth torn from her dress. She made herself obvious. The boy waited until the sounds of pursuit shifted, voices angling toward her trail, dogs pulling hard in the same direction. Then he turned and went the other way, slipping into thick brush, every step agony, every breath a promise. The separation felt like tearing something vital loose. For the girl, the change was immediate. The hunt sharpened around her, voices growing louder, closer. Dogs bayed with renewed certainty. Men shouted directions, energized now that they believed they had the right trail. She ran, not blindly but boldly. She crossed open ground at full speed, letting herself be seen. She stumbled deliberately once, leaving a scuffed trail, then recovered. She crossed a shallow stream without masking her path fully, just enough to suggest panic. Behind her the pursuit exploded. She heard them shouting her description, exaggerating it already. Small but fast. Smart. Don't let her double back. She smiled grimly and doubled back anyway. At a fork in the land where two gullies met, she vanished into a tangle of brush, then circled wide, re-entering her own trail from behind. She moved against the flow, careful, precise, stepping only where others had already disturbed the ground. She passed within yards of three men without being seen, their attention locked forward, minds fixed on capture ahead. She slipped away into cover and changed direction again. For hours she did this, leading, folding, unraveling the hunt until men shouted at one another in frustration, dogs confused by overlapping scents, the confidence drained from their voices, replaced by sharpness, then anger. Meanwhile, the boy moved slowly, methodically, staying low, using pain as a measure rather than an obstacle. He followed creek beds, crawled when he had to, rested only when his vision threatened to darken completely. Once, he collapsed behind a fallen tree, breath ragged, sweat soaking his clothes. He pressed his face into the dirt, fighting despair. He thought of his sister's hands on his face, her certainty, her command. He stood again. By nightfall, the hunt fractured. Men argued loudly about which direction was true. Some wanted to continue forward, others insisted the trail had been lost. A few began to fear they were being played. They were right. The girl climbed into a tree overlooking one of their temporary camps as darkness fell. She watched men eat, drink, complain. She memorized faces, movements, patterns. She waited until exhaustion dulled their edges. Then she moved again. She slipped into camp silently, lifted a coil of rope from one pile, knocked over a lantern near another, letting oil spill slowly into the dirt. She left no fingerprints, no clear signs, just enough disorder to breed mistrust. When she left, she broke branches in a different direction entirely, letting the sound carry. The camp erupted in confusion moments later, shouting. A lantern flared. Orders snapped. By the time they organized, she was gone. Elsewhere, the boy reached a ridge that overlooked a river gorge. He nearly wept at the sight of water, not for thirst, but for cover. He descended carefully, inch by inch, finally collapsing at the edge. He submerged himself as deeply as he could, cold biting into his bones, washing sweat and scent away. He stayed until his lungs screamed, then surfaced silently. He followed the river downstream under moonlight, letting it carry him where it would. By morning, the hunters realized something was wrong. They had chased hard. They had chased long. and they had nothing to show for it but exhaustion and anger. Some blamed the dogs, some blamed the terrain, some blamed each other. One man, older than the rest, spat into the dirt and said quietly, "They're not running anymore, they're moving us." That idea spread like poison. Fear followed. By the end of the fifth stretch, the siblings were miles apart and closer than ever. They did not know when they would reunite. They did not know what shape the hunt would take next. But they knew this much deep in their bones. The hunters were no longer certain of themselves, and that uncertainty was the most dangerous weapon of all. Night had a different weight now that they were apart. For the boy, darkness pressed inward, magnifying every sound, every movement. Without his sister's presence to anchor his thoughts, the land felt larger, more indifferent. Pain kept him focused. His leg burned constantly now, swelling, stiffening his joints. But pain also sharpened him. It forced precision. It forced honesty. There was no room left for panic when each step demanded full attention. He followed the river until the banks narrowed and the water grew fast and loud, carving through stone. The roar masked his movement, but it also drowned out warning. He slipped twice on slick rock, once hard enough to knock the breath from his chest. He lay still afterward, staring up at the broken pattern of stars through branches, counting heartbeats until dizziness passed. He moved again. By dawn, he reached a stretch where the river bent sharply and plunged into a gorge. The walls rose steep and sheer, dark with moisture and moss. No easy way down, no clear way up. It was a bad place to be cornered, and a perfect place to vanish. He climbed. The ascent was slow and brutal. He tested every hold, trusting nothing without proof. His injured leg screamed with every push, muscles shaking, vision narrowing. More than once, he thought he might fall. Each time, he pictured his sister's face, calm and unyielding, and found another inch of strength. At the top, he collapsed into brush, chest heaving, hands trembling uncontrollably. He stayed there until the shaking eased, then forced himself to crawl farther inland away from the edge. Below him, the river swallowed his trail completely. By mid-morning, he heard dogs, not close, but coming. He adjusted course immediately, angling through a stand of young trees so dense it forced him to crouch. Branches whipped his face. Thorns snagged his clothes. He welcomed the pain. It kept him awake. He found a shallow depression filled with leaf litter and slid into it, pulling debris over himself until only his eyes and nose remained exposed. He slowed his breathing, counting each inhale, each exhale, letting his heartbeat settle. The dogs passed within yards. He smelled them before he heard them clearly. Wet fur, sharp and animal. He watched paws move through the undergrowth, handlers' boots following, men muttering to one another. One dog paused, the boy's muscles locked. Sweat trickled down his spine despite the cool air. The dog sniffed, head tilting, confused. The handler tugged the leash impatiently. "Come on," the man snapped. "Trail's cold." They moved on. The boy remained buried for another hour before daring to move. Elsewhere, the girl moved like a rumor. She did not run now. She walked when she could, paced herself, conserved energy. She listened more than she moved, using sound as a map. Voices carried differently when men were tired. Shorter tempers, looser discipline. She exploited that. She doubled back frequently, crossing paths she had already disturbed, weaving a web of uncertainty. She learned which men shouted first when confused, which ones hesitated. She watched how camps formed and broke, how leadership shifted under pressure. At one camp, she listened from the shadows as men argued. "She led us in circles," one growled. "No," another snapped. "You lost the trail." She doubled back. "She couldn't have." The girl slipped away while their voices rose, leaving behind a single clear footprint in the opposite direction, a seed of doubt planted carefully. By afternoon, clouds rolled in again, thick and low. Thunder rumbled distantly. The girl welcomed the storm. She angled toward higher ground where rain would break scent and flatten tracks. She paused at the edge of a clearing and watched a patrol cross it, 5 men, tense, scanning constantly. She waited until they passed, then crossed openly behind them, letting the rain wash her steps into the mud just enough to be noticed. She wanted them to see her. They did. A shout rang out. Another followed. She ran, heart pounding, timing her movements so she stayed just ahead of capture without fully escaping. She wanted them invested, focused, predictable. She led them toward a stretch of land riddled with sinkholes masked by grass and rainwater. She skirted them lightly, feet knowing where weight could be trusted. The men behind her did not. One fell hard, vanishing up to his waist with a curse. Another stumbled, trying to help him. The line broke. The girl disappeared into the rain. The The storm broke fully as night fell, rain hammering the ground, lightning tearing the sky open. Camp struggled to stay lit. Men huddled, miserable, angry, exhausted. Some wanted to quit, others wanted blood. Meanwhile, the boy found shelter beneath an overhanging rock deep in the woods. He bound his leg again, tighter this time. Teeth gritted against pain. He ate a handful of berries he recognized as safe, chewing slowly, forcing nourishment into his body. He slept in fragments, waking at every crack of thunder, every imagined footstep. Just before dawn, he dreamed of his sister standing at the riverbank, calling his name. He woke with a start, heart racing, unsure for a moment whether the sound had been real. It had not, but something else was. He heard movement, quiet, careful, approaching, not dogs, not a patrol, a single person. He reached for his knife, holding his breath. A shape emerged through the brush, hands raised slowly. It was her. For a moment neither of them moved. Then she crossed the remaining distance and pressed her forehead to his, both of them shaking with relief they did not allow themselves to voice. "You're hurt," she said immediately, hands already assessing his leg. "I'm alive," he replied hoarsely. "So are you." "They're breaking," she said. "Not all of them, but enough." He nodded. "They think we're everywhere." She allowed herself a brief, tired smile. Good. They rested only long enough for her to tend his leg properly, cleaning it as best she could, rebinding it with care. Then they moved again, together once more, slipping away before daylight could betray them. Behind them, the hunt began to unravel. Men argued openly now. Some refused to follow orders they no longer trusted. Dogs grew unreliable, confused by overlapping trails and broken patterns. Camps shifted constantly, leadership eroding under exhaustion and doubt. The story had grown beyond control. Two siblings no longer sounded like prey. They sounded like something else, something the land itself was sheltering. As the sixth stretch ended, the siblings moved deeper into terrain. Few men knew well, carrying with them not just survival but momentum. The hunters still outnumbered them, but numbers no longer felt like certainty, and certainty was everything. By the seventh stretch, the hunt had begun to rot from the inside. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with silence where orders should have been, with men hesitating before moving, with dogs pulling less eagerly at their leashes. It started with questions spoken too late at night, around dying fires, when exhaustion stripped bravado away and left only truth. Why were they still chasing? The siblings felt the change before they saw it. The land grew quieter behind them. Not empty, never empty, but uneven. Sounds came in bursts instead of waves. Shouts rose, then died without answer. Horns blew and were not echoed. The rhythm that had once pressed relentlessly at their backs began to stutter. They moved together now with a new understanding. Not the desperate coordination of escape, but the deliberate movement of those who knew they were no longer reacting. They were shaping. The boy's leg remained injured, but it had stabilized. Pain still flared, sharp and insistent, yet it no longer dominated him. He had learned its limits. He adjusted his stride instinctively, using terrain to spare it, choosing routes that leaned on balance rather than strength. The girl watched everything. She noticed which paths felt untouched, which clearings smelled of men even when no one stood there. She read the ground like a living thing, sensing where the hunters had been, and more importantly, where they were afraid to go. They crossed into a region of broken highland, where the forest thinned and rock jutted out in long, uneven spines. Wind moved freely here, carrying scent away, scattering sound. Visibility stretched far in some directions and collapsed entirely in others. Men hated this place. It offered too many unknowns. On the first morning there, the siblings crested a rise and saw 3 hunters below them, arguing openly. One gestured angrily toward the trees behind them. Another shook his head, pointing east. The third stood, silent, staring at the ground as if the earth itself had betrayed him. The siblings watched without moving. The argument ended with no resolution. The men split, each heading in a different direction. The girl exhaled slowly. "They're fracturing." "Yes," the boy said, "and that makes them dangerous." "Only if they're still certain of us," she replied. "They're not." They descended carefully, circling wide around the area, leaving no trace this time. They no longer needed to lure. Now they needed to disappear. But disappearance was not enough. The girl stopped near a narrow saddle between 2 ridges, where paths naturally converged. She studied the ground, then the sky, then the boy. "Help me here," she said. They worked together in silence, deliberate and patient. They disturbed the earth just enough to suggest passage, prints leading one way, scuffed stones another. They snapped branches at different heights, smeared mud where none belonged, and then erased their own true trail entirely by moving along bare rock. They left behind confusion, not pursuit. By midday, voices rose behind them again, but not in coordination. One group shouted from the north, another answered from the south. Orders overlapped, contradictions multiplied. The boy listened, grim satisfaction tightening his chest. "They're chasing versions of us." "Yes," the girl said, "and none of them are real." They took shelter in a narrow cleft as the afternoon grew hot. The boy drank sparingly from a hidden spring, water cold and clear. The girl washed her hands and face, grounding herself in the sensation, reminding her body it still existed beyond survival. That night, something changed again. They heard gunfire, not warning shots, angry shots, then shouting, sharp, accusatory. A man cried out, followed by more yelling. The sounds were not of pursuit, but of conflict. The siblings did not move. They listened. It went on for several minutes, then stopped abruptly. Silence followed, heavy and uneasy. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "They're turning on each other." The boy nodded. Fear always needs somewhere to land. They moved after midnight, slipping through the darkness with renewed caution. They avoided the source of the disturbance, giving it wide berth, trusting that chaos would keep men occupied longer than any trail could. At dawn, they reached the edge of a high overlook. Below them spread a vast stretch of land, rivers winding like scars, forests layered in shades of green, hills folding into one another endlessly. Somewhere beyond all of it lay places the hunt could not reach, not because they were unreachable, but because they were not worth the cost. The boy sat heavily, breath slow and deep. "We could keep going," he said. "Never stop." The girl shook her head. They'd follow, not all of them. But enough. Then what? She looked back toward the land they had crossed, eyes thoughtful. "Then we end this." He frowned. "How? By becoming too expensive." They waited until midday heat dulled movement. Then they descended toward a river crossing known to locals, a narrow stone shelf that allowed passage when water was low. Hunters would know it too. They made no attempt to hide this time. They crossed openly, leaving clear signs. On the far bank they paused long enough to let the trail feel real, then vanished into a maze of boulders and brush only a few yards away. They did not go far. They watched. By late afternoon the first hunters arrived. Then more. Then many. They gathered at the crossing, voices loud, confidence returning at the sight of something solid to follow. Dogs strained forward. The siblings waited until the group was fully committed, clustered tightly. Then the girl stepped out. She stood on a rock above them, visible, unmistakable. The wind caught her hair, lifted it like a signal. She did not run. The boy remained hidden, heart hammering. Shouts erupted instantly. Rifles were raised. Dogs lunged. The girl raised her hands slowly, not in surrender, but in command. "You're done," she called down, her voice carrying clearly. "You've chased ghosts for days. You've lost men. You've lost time. You've lost yourselves." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a man laughed nervously. "Get her!" Before anyone could act, the boy rose from the opposite side, stepping into view with effort, leaning heavily on his good leg but standing tall. "Look at us," he said. "Really look." Confusion rippled through the group. "You think we're prey," the girl continued, "but prey doesn't choose where you stand. Prey doesn't decide when you arrive." The wind shifted. Dogs whined, uneasy. "You can keep chasing," the boy said, "but every mile costs you more men, more sleep, more certainty." A murmur spread. Some men shifted uncomfortably, others tightened grips on weapons. The girl's eyes swept the group. "Ask yourselves why you're still here." Silence stretched. Finally, one man spoke, voice rough. "We can't just let you go." "No," she agreed. "You can't." She stepped back slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact. The boy did the same. They disappeared into cover without running. No shots followed. No dogs were released. The hunters stood frozen, staring at the place where the siblings had vanished, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. By nightfall, half the men had left. By morning, more followed. The hunt did not end with a victory or a capture. It ended with a decision. Do we continue, knowing what it costs, knowing what we've become? Most chose not to answer that question at all. The siblings moved on before dawn, leaving behind no trail this time, no riddle to solve, only absence. and absence in the end was something the hunters could not fight. By the 8th stretch, the world itself seemed to bend around them. They had moved through rivers, hills, swamps, forests, and broken farmland. They had slipped past hunters, dogs, and men who believed themselves cleverer than the land itself. By now, the siblings knew every sound, every shadow, every nuance of the terrain they crossed, and yet the final stretch demanded more than knowledge. It demanded mastery, patience, and a kind of ruthlessness that came only from living constantly under the threat of death. They started before dawn, leaving the night's residual fog to veil them as they moved. Each step measured, the girl followed close, silent as a shadow, eyes scanning every ridge, every hollow, every bend in the trees. They moved as one unit, seamless in rhythm, perfectly attuned to each other's presence. This was no longer escape, it was execution. Their path led to an area the girl had scouted days before, an abandoned plantation long overtaken by wild growth. Buildings lay in ruin, fences collapsed, and fields were nothing more than tangled weeds and grasses. To any pursuer, it looked uninhabited, impossible to navigate efficiently, and completely devoid of strategic advantage. That was why she chose it. That was why they moved through it with deliberate care. The boy stumbled over a fallen beam, groaning quietly. She reached out immediately, steadying him. "Not yet," she whispered. "We keep moving." He nodded, gritting his teeth against the pain that threatened to slow him. Every step was agony, but every step carried purpose. They descended into the main yard, moving between ruins like ghosts. Their presence was deliberate but invisible. Crumbling walls shielded them. Overgrown hedges masked their path. The birds, startled by their movement, made sudden flight into the foggy light, leaving brief shadows that made hunters' eyes twitch. They stopped at what remained of the old well. Water inside was murky, but it offered an opportunity. She motioned to him. He understood immediately. Using a fallen branch and the stones scattered around, they created a trail that led toward the well. The N vanished around the back of the structure. Any observer might think the siblings had entered the ruin or were trapped inside. Meanwhile, sounds of pursuit echoed faintly in the distance. Hunters, overconfident from recent frustrations, were reckless now. They had brought more men, more dogs, more equipment, all to corner two children whose survival instinct had become legendary. But the siblings knew something the hunters did not. Desperation often blinded more than it focused. They skirted the well and moved to a grove of twisted oaks whose roots arched above the ground, creating natural tunnels and hiding spots. Here, the boy paused to catch his breath, leaning heavily on a root while she scanned the surrounding trees. The canopy above filtered light into thin green shafts, making the forest floor mottled and difficult to read. "They're close," he whispered. "I can hear them." "Good," she said softly. "Let them get close. Let them believe they've won." They crouched low, pressed flat against the uneven earth, allowing the sound of their own ragged breathing to blend with the wind. A dog barked in the distance, followed by shouting. Hunters emerged onto the edge of the grove, scanning, rifles ready. The dog nosed toward the ground, then retreated, confused. A man cursed, stepping into a hollow and twisting his ankle. Another tripped over a root. The siblings moved again, silent and precise. Each misstep of the hunters added time, confusion, and exhaustion. Hours had passed since their separation earlier, but it was not exhaustion alone that defined the hunt now. It was fear. Fear crept into men's minds like a slow poison, fueled by repeated failures and the uncanny skill of the two siblings. By midday, they reached a cliffside overlooking a wide valley. The boy's leg throbbed painfully, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The girl scanned the valley below. A small river cut through it, wide enough to impede pursuit. Further, the terrain was filled with boulders, fallen trees, and natural cover. "This is it," she whispered. "We finished this stretch here." He nodded, gripping his knife tightly. They descended carefully, using boulders and twisted roots as natural steps, creating a route only they could navigate safely. Behind them, hunters' voices rose intermittently, frustrated at the slow progress and difficulty of tracking. As night approached, the girl had an idea. She collected branches, mud, and leaves, constructing false trails that led back toward the valley. Then she spread out small, deliberate signs of their presence, footprints, scraps of cloth, broken sticks arranged to suggest direction. When hunters reached the valley in pursuit, they would find nothing but deception. They continued moving under the cover of darkness, reaching the river by midnight. Here, they paused, listening. The water roared softly over rocks, masking their next movements. The boy waded into the cold current, allowing the river to carry his scent away from land trails. She followed, skillfully stepping behind him so that currents and shadows obscured her presence entirely. The river was treacherous. Logs floated unpredictably, and swift currents threatened to unbalance them. Each step demanded complete focus. For a moment the boy slipped, plunging into waist-deep water. She caught him instantly, steadying him against the current. "Almost," she whispered, "almost done." They moved downstream for hours, silent but for the splash of water around their legs. Hunters had reached the riverbanks behind them, but the distance they had built over days made pursuit impossible at this point. Exhaustion, fear, and the difficulty of terrain slowed them too much. By dawn, the siblings reached a wide, overgrown marsh beyond the river. Here, the land became a labyrinth of reeds, shallow pools, and hidden channels. Hunters were unlikely to navigate